All right, Sona. So, first of all, I was planning to put out an episode last week to talk about Furiosa and the whole Mad Max series, which I rewatched all the movies. I do recommend Furiosa. I don't even know if I'm going to go and spend that much time discussing it here on the podcast, although I'll probably publish somewhere in here, get into it in a little more detail. But I do want to call it out for the fact that maybe the reason I don't need to publish that episode is because yet again, this summer movie season just seems to be one flop after another. This movie was a big flop. I have some thoughts on why so many movies are flopping. Speaking of flops, The Fall Guy, a movie I thought was very entertaining, flopped so badly that just 17 days after being in theaters, released in theaters, that it's now available to stream at home. I do recommend that as well. Very fun. But just to speak to the fact that the big summer movies are already available at home within weeks of their release. So it just goes to speak to the fact that there is a crisis, I think, of theater going. And anyway, I do want to get into all that. Sona, I know you're not a big movie goer, especially with a small child in the house.
Even in the best of times, I have not been. But I will say here in the Northeast, or at least in the New York metro area, we've had way better weather earlier than we usually do. And that alone would keep me out of the movie theater because to me, that's like we're stuck at home. It's crappy out. What are we going to do type thing.
Yeah, that's true. It's a good point. And I think whether all these things figure in, we'll be discussing, I'll be recapping the new Benedict Cumberbatch series, Eric, which just premiered on Netflix. And maybe you'll want to check that out. And maybe we can discuss it next week, for example. So there's another distraction, having something to stream at home, something that would be prestigious in the past, obviously. And also a movie coming out next year for next week, I should say, from Richard Linklater, which I've already seen, called Hitman, with starring Glenn Powell. It's really, really entertaining. Definitely the type of movie that people would have in the olden days been a word of mouth hit in movie theaters, and now, of course, going straight to Netflix. So all of this is to speak to this changing landscape. Speaking of changing landscapes, the real reason we're here to talk about, I had been trying to think there's a lot of big, high profile shows coming out in June that we'll be discussing here. The Bear, probably my most anticipated, but of course, House of the Dragon, a hugely popular spinoff from the Game of Thrones series. The Boys, which is probably the most popular series on Amazon Prime to this date, also premiering on practically the same date. A very prestigious remake of Presumed Innocent starring Jake Gyllenhaal, all coming mid-June. So there's a lot of prestigious stuff coming in the next month. But I was trying to find things for us to discuss here on the show, and that might be intriguing to both of us. And I came up with two shows that I was like, I don't even know if I'm going to watch these series all the way to the end, but let's give it a shot. And I was intrigued enough, but it is interesting that we're in this moment where there's so much content, but maybe it's not great. It's okay, but it's not great. And I think we have two examples of these very mid quality TV series here in this case, which both wrapped up within days of each other, within a day of each other, both available on Hulu. One is The Veil, this spy thriller starring Elizabeth Moss from Stephen Knight, the British writer, and on Hulu, also available, but from FX, Under the Bridge. They were coming off of the huge success of Shogun. I'm sure this series, whether it's successful or not, I'm sure it's not as successful as that. That's for sure. Oh, and by the way, we've had people complain in the past that when we're covering two topics that you have to jump around in the episode. We will not do spoilers at first. We will definitely have to spoil both of these finales. So when I announce that there's spoilers, do check the show notes if you want to jump to the next topic. I think we should start with The Veil. I think there's less to say there, I think, but you might have a lot of things to say. And before we get into any kind of spoilers, this is uneven. Both of these shows, by the way, very uneven. But my question to you, Son, is would you recommend these shows given how they turn out by the end? Well, let's start with The Veil. Would you recommend The Veil?
What a hard question. You know what? This was a short one, right? It was only 6 episodes.
Yep.
I would say in total, I enjoyed it. So I would recommend it mildly, if that's a thing, with the advice to not get too invested in it. Because boy, that last episode was something. If I have to choose a side, I will choose recommend. How about you?
I feel the same way, to be honest. One of the things that intrigued me early on, critics got to see this entire short series. I do totally agree. If this was 10 episodes, I would tell people don't bother. If you like spy thrillers, if you like Elizabeth Moss, I think those two things recommend it. It is intriguing enough. This is a pretty generic plot line. And the strongest part of the show here is the relationship between these two women who, if anybody has no exposure to this at all, Elizabeth Moss and this other actress, I have her name. It is a problem when you have a show where one actress is very famous and the other one not as famous, to say the least.
It was nice in any case to see in a spy thriller two women being the principal characters, which I think is not something that you see all that often.
Yeah, and in the actress's name playing Adila, who is in the show suspected to be this ISIS mastermind. And what's really unique in the show and what recommended it initially really is like those first two episodes when they're in this car together and you know that they are both lying to each other. They know at some level that they are manipulating each other, but there is a quid pro quo. There is a need to rely on each other, whether they trust each other or not. And they're fully aware of it. So I really like this almost playing poker with your cards on the table, and it's all head games at that point. And if the show had somehow been able to continue in that vein, that is the strongest aspect of the show. Then they end up back in France and then eventually in London. So it's beautiful that they travel to these different those locations.
Is very nice.
But once things calm down and they're not on the run anymore and they're settled in, and then you get into the machinations of which is entertaining, by the way, like the CIA and MI6 and the French special forces as well, and how they're all also trying to manipulate each other as well with their cards on the table. All of that's intriguing and pretty well done. But like you said, this whole thing really falls apart in the finale because it is such we'll have to spoil the finale. We're not spoiling just quite yet, but it really just is. If you really need things to land for you in a finale, if that's important, then no, I don't recommend this. But if you like Elizabeth Moss, if you are intrigued by the relationship between these two women when you watch the first couple of episodes, then yeah, you should sample it, I think, or try it.
I'm neutral about Elizabeth Moss, but I did, and I haven't watched all that much with her in it, most notably Mad Men, but I didn't watch Handmaid's Tale. Some of her acting choices seemed a little bit strange here, I felt, or her facial expressions anyway. I don't know if you felt the same way, though.
I feel like she has certain things she does that are, I don't want to be insulting. There are certain things she does expression-wise where to convey things that she can lean into a little too much. And I do see her leaning into some of those things here. Once again, though, I don't necessarily blame the performer if you have certain tics or certain behaviors that you lean on a lot, then
somebody should tell you to stop.
This is something that I find very entertaining when people go at performers and going, I don't understand how this actor who's so good, yada, 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 gave such a terrible performance, as if the actor decides what the edit looks like. The actors oftentimes are giving multiple versions of the same line readings, and then it's assembled after the fact. So a lot of that is they're relying on the directors and the producers and the showrunners in the case of a TV show to make them basically, right? You're really putting you can, I am sure you can take even The Godfather and assemble footage there that would make everyone look absolutely embarrassing, right? You're really relying on the assembly of the show. She doesn't embarrass herself here, I don't believe, right? But
no, I don't.
I do think that there are certain almost like cliches of the way she behaves that they lean into a little bit here, and they should, and it's the responsibility of the filmmakers not to do that, right? If you don't want her to give a very Elizabeth Moss heavy performance, then you can edit around those choices and those particular takes.
Fair. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was just going to add that I did think that the accent is interesting because it works sometimes and it's pretty convincing. And sometimes it really feels like she is putting on a British accent, right? It's almost like you're waiting for the other shoe to drop That's a lie as well.
I don't think this is a spoiler at all. I think one of the things that didn't work for me here, and maybe one of the reasons that I was paying attention to that, is I feel like the way they have created her character, let's call her Imogen, it is dependent on her being irresistibly charismatic. And I did not find this character to be irresistibly charismatic.
That's what's interesting about it too, because there are times when she's traveling, for example, with Adila, who's played by the actress's name who I couldn't pull up before, was Yumna Marwan, who I've never seen anything before, but I think she's very good here.
Great.
There are times when Imogen, let's call her, like you said, she has another name that we discover by the end, but she comes off as really erratic and like dangerous. By the way, that kind of is intriguing in the context of the show, because you feel like that's part of her game, is to come off as you can't really trust me, but then they're stuck in this car together. So all of that works better as some kind of psychological warfare when they are really truly trapped together and there's no other way out. And I guess even as they get back into civilization, that continues to be the case. They have to keep relying on each other because now, of course, all these agencies are aligned against them, etc. So I guess there's more of that, but I do agree that basically I look at her behavior, especially when we get to the end of the show, and the idea that she is the only one who can do this job. I'm like, is she even good at her job? She almost got all these people killed. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, we can get into it with the spoilers, but there is a body count.
Okay, so with that basic yes or no, which I think we're both very much on the fence, the thumb sideways, as we discussed those before, maybe we get into the spoilers now. So the basic setup here, of course, is that this Adila woman, she is indeed working with ISIS to have a dirty bomb explode in a New York harbor. They need the name of the ship. They've pretty much figured this all out. Interesting, by the way, that all of these high-level operatives pretty much have figured out the entire plot, except for the name of the ship. And we know the plot because we're seeing in parallel these side storylines where we see this terrorist basically creating the bomb and putting it on board of a ship, which we don't know the name of it, etc. So we see these things, so we know what's going on. But the how these other agents figure out what's going on is really funny, because we just see them like Josh Charles' character just shows up and is like, it's a dirty bomb. It's headed towards one of these three. And it's like, how do you know that? We just heard some chatter. Their spy work is like, we don't know how it works. It's just magic.
Yeah, I mean, I am always one to go with the hand wavy thing. I don't necessarily need the plot to follow through and dot every I and cross every T. And here, especially because it was a shorter series and I thought the story was interesting, I didn't over examine it, but I suspect there are many plot holes here that I didn't necessarily have the interest in running them down, but probably there are a lot of things that don't really add up here.
So after that initial setup, these two women trying to rely on each other, Elizabeth Moss keeps saying, don't torture her, don't kidnap her daughter. She's trying to reunite with her daughter. Here, this woman, she apparently is willing to potentially kill thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, who knows, to just basically know that she can be reunited with her daughter. We're supposed to be sympathetic to this way of thinking, which I am not firm that it is okay, or that there's no other way out of the situation, especially at that moment where she is pretty much theoretically in the hands of the military. And even if you have to like trust that the US government or the British government is going to follow through on this deal, and she basically has the detonator in her hand, and Imogen is still, honestly, could just separate her from the detonator at that moment if she was a little more less subtle about her tactics. But that's the situation we're in as we get to the finale. And this is where even some of this at this moment, I'm forgiving the show still. She doesn't know that maybe she has the bomb. She's afraid that, who knows, like if she does intercede, the bomb will go off automatically if there's no-go code, for example. So there are ways I can write this and still forgive the show up until this point.
I don't know all that much about remote detonations of bombs, but you can do this from thousands of miles away?
Yeah, as long as they have a cell signal, right? Like you just need to receive the phone call and then you could detonate that bomb. And there's a huge question as to you have someone on the ship who can detonate it.
Yeah.
Now we are jumping directly into spoilers, by the way. So the bomb doesn't go off. So the big surprise there. But this is direct spoilers now. We do see in the final moments of the episode that the terrorist that's on board of the ship itself is basically trying to detonate the bomb because he's there on the ship. Why you need to have a remote detonator, if that's the case, I don't understand. That the idea that this woman is the only one who could have come up with this. What did they do? They took nuclear
Core something.
whatever the nuclear material from like an MRI machine or something. I misidentified that earlier in when I was recapping the show, by the way. It's just from like an abandoned MRI machine in Russia or something like that. So anyone could have done that. And then they get it on board of a ship. I don't know how she was involved with that other than suggesting it. And now she's the one who's detonating the bomb. Why would she have to be the one who detonates the bomb when they openly do not trust her? Like at this point, none of that makes sense to me. And it can only be detonated by this remote cell phone. Really? Only? I don't understand that aspect of it all. And by the way, if the bomb is just going to go off and nothing can be done about it, then if that was the plan, then why have a remote detonator? And if she's the only one that can detonate the bomb remotely, why would they need that? Like she hasn't made any kind of demands that they pay X number of dollars or release these terrorists or we're going to detonate the ship. They are just going to do it in the blind. So what is the purpose of the remote detonator? These are just questions that just don't make any sense at all.
Okay.
Although, yes, so mechanically it can work, but
Okay. That's something.
not only that, they're at sea somewhere. What if you have bad cell service? They probably would have some kind of fallback, which once again, if you can detonate from the ship, why do we need the remote detonator? Huge question marks here. So yes, so she has this remote detonator. They haven't caught that. But this, believe it or not, even with that whole digression there of the logistics of that, that's not even the worst of it. The worst,
Oh, no.
this agent, Imogen, let's call her, who has this backstory of her father and his apprentice, who is now basically in his place. He's this incredibly rich, British, noble person who apparently is a double agent. He believes that the world needs chaos right now. He wants to profit from it. And we can get into his philosophy, which I don't know if you believe that or not. But way more important than that is the fact, this huge coincidence that Imogen has this shady father who was assassinated. Turns out that he was a Russian agent, that this other character played by James Purefoy, Michael in the series, who is her ex-lover as well. She's going back into his arms because he's the only person who can protect him because he has all these connections. He's this double agent and he also has taught her everything she knows. This turns out to be the person who is really pulling off this terrorist attack. What do you think about the coincidence that needs to be required for us to believe this final twist?
This is actually like the least of my problems with it. Like, ah, I didn't like anything about this whole England estate portion of
Yes.
this show. The scenes were so stilted to me. Like, it was like Clue. I'll meet you in the shed. I'll meet you in the dining room. I'll meet you in the bedroom. Where are we doing this? How had it not occurred to her that if her father was a double agent, the person that was like his brother was probably also a double agent? First of all. Second of all, and this was raised before and it occurred to me, but I didn't think it through because they didn't introduce the character yet. But how sick is it that she ended up in a romantic relationship with this guy after her father purportedly died? And what happened to the child that they keep referencing? And apparently this overarching bond between her and Adila was partially, at least, if not primarily, based on the fact that they are both mothers and understand that you would do anything for your child. Yet we never really hear much except these tangential references to this child's existence. I don't understand what happened there. I'm sure it was devastating, but I would like to know so I could go on this ride with you. These are just the things that I'm saying off the top of my head here.
If you want to organize your thoughts while I things that go into, like the daughter thing is huge. Like you said, this is the one thing that basically bonds these two women to each other. And there is a version of this show, which I actually hoped in a way that we were going to get about halfway through. Imagine that Imogen's instincts are wrong, and she's so obsessed with this mother and her daughter and basically playing out her own version of her fantasy of this lost relationship with her daughter, that she ends up allowing this catastrophe to happen. I think that's a more interesting version of this show. But to your point, they just introduced this daughter. We have no idea what actually happened to her. I was so confused early on. It's like, oh, the daughter must have died when she was a baby. And in the flashback, when we see that young girl, that's Imogen, right? It's not.
I had assumed that because of something or the other. I don't remember why, but yes.
And then, but then we see that the daughter, the granddaughter or daughter, I guess, was older at some point. What happened to her? Was it an accident? At one point, I'm like, did she die during the assassination of the dad? But if that was the case, then you can only imagine how furious she would be, vengeful at the people who assassinated him, right? I don't know. Like, I really don't know. I have at all what happened to this girl, what age she was when she died, what her relationship was with her mom. Were they close, or was she already a jet-setting spy and being raised primarily by her granddad? Who knows? I know nothing about this incredibly important relationship. It's bizarre. It's just so bizarre.
I have other comments, but yes. Keep going.
Talk about the compound for a little bit, and maybe this will give you some frame to your other critiques. This is just something that I was thinking about only in preparing for this conversation, but it's so insane. This guy is the mastermind behind this huge terrorist attack. This thing is about to happen. Josh Charles, playing Max, and Malik, which is her current lover, the French agent, both end up on the compound, and literally Malik shoots Michael in the head during lovemaking, basically. A very awkward situation there, the dynamic there.
Yes, after Max has already been shot.
Exactly.
Right.
But more, but to that point, so Max gets in there,
By the
Malik gets in there,
henchman. Yeah.
the henchman is there on this compound of this guy who's about to detonate a nuclear bomb in the US. They don't have security cameras. They don't have, like, this is the security they have. Like, I know this is like a nitpick.
No, it occurred to me as well.
Preposterous. It's absolutely preposterous that this guy has these people roaming around his house. He doesn't even have security cameras notifying him there's people inside of his house. What is going on?
Yeah, that occurred to me as well, along with, I know this is a very old manor, but maybe I'm just not familiar, but like, does sound not carry whatsoever? How far is the bedroom from where the gunshots were? Because certainly that would at least give you pause for a second. Maybe they couldn't hear it.
Especially in a giant empty house. If you've ever stayed in Airbnb in some of these beautiful abandoned mansions, those things, you walk up the stairs, that stairs are popping and creaking.
Yeah.
And the idea that, and by the way, if you have, it's an Airbnb and there's 25 people walking around all the time. Suspicious. But if you're like, as
Right.
far as you know,
You're the only people that.
in the entire house, like, who's able to creep around and haven't been in before and silently, right? This whole finale is just preposterous. Like, where did they come up with this? It's insane. It's really just crazy.
Yeah.
Worst spycraft I've ever seen. And then, of course, we get to the very ending where Adila now has not told her the name of the ship because she says, I won't tell you until I can see my daughter with my own eyes. They have to trust each other, these two women. They're about to make their escape. The henchmen, of course, once again, how do you not kill the person who's trying to kill you? I'm sorry. Indiscriminately, people die in this show all the time. 2 episodes ago, she smashed that motorcyclist in the head with a metal pipe like 25 times. They just trust that he's dead. They make their break for it. The henchman comes, once again, roaring back from the dead, and kills Abdullah. And then, of course, at that moment, we think, well, this thing's going to detonate. There's no hope. But of course, she has written, there's their special code between these two women. She's written the name of the ship on the glass. And then Imogen's own breath makes it appear. And she's like, thank you. Thank you, Adila.
It was a nice callback to that opening episode or two or whatever it was, where someone wrote a note, right, with a phone number or whatever.
She wrote the phone number. Yeah, she wanted to track, yeah, on the window.
So that was nice amongst all the clue chaos that was going on in the English manor.
I don't know if you want to say anything else about this ridiculous sequence here in the English manor, because I want to touch on the very, very end of the episode.
Oh my God, the end of this episode. That's what really put it over for me to WTF. I think without that, I might have been like, I don't know about this ending, but oh my gosh, these last few minutes. Go ahead.
Yeah. So then it turns out that, like you mentioned, that she has been in this sexual relationship with this man for many years, apparently. Turns out she just wanders deeper into the grounds and finds a house where her dad has been living this whole time. Her dad's not dead. He's alive, and he faked his own assassination, and he's been tracking her. He's got a little scrapbook of all of her achievements and things. And by the way, what a horrible scene where Elizabeth Moss is monologuing the entire time and quoting Shakespeare. Like, this whole sequence is just the worst written things I've ever seen. I'm talking my way away. I'm talking myself out of giving this thing even a moment. Because of this ending.
I mean, she has spent so much time on this estate, first of all. And I don't know, maybe the dad recently relocated to this property. But to me, it was like, how did you never investigate this earlier? I don't know. Maybe he thought she was permanently gone. And so now I'm trying to like retroactively make this make sense. Maybe he thought she was permanently gone now that she's an international spy and there's no chance of her discovering this. I don't know. I also don't know why in that giant house you would choose to have your little setup in a separate property, but whatever. Plenty of rooms for everybody in that immense mansion. But yeah, like how, why, what? All of the interrogatories here. Mostly why.
In my mind, I pictured that he does hang out in the mansion most of the time. And then Michael's like, she's come. Go to your shack. She's escaped from the shack. But by the way, even that, I'm saying that jokingly, I don't even believe that because it's like such a nest for him, right?
Yeah.
Scrapbooks around it.
The blanket smells like him.
Exactly.
And isn't this like duplicative of the work in the other shed? Like, why don't they just combine forces? Keep all their stuff in the same place. It just seems like two Carrie Homeland map setups is a bit much. But yeah, I don't know why we needed this. I think it would have worked marginally better if the father was just really dead. What did we gain from this? He was willing to let his daughter believe he was dead. Or were we supposed to, I don't know. And watch her be groomed by his best friend. It just is, I don't know.
I mean, that's the craziest part is when you think like he has been there on the ground, supposedly on and off at least, if not, it looks like, once again, that's a nest for him. So it looks like he's there most of the time. And like you said, back in the house the whole time, Michael's grooming his daughter. And what is happening? Oh my God. Okay. But that is terrible. No, granted. But even more ridiculous to me, to be honest, is the final button on the episode. There's one thing is we see this reconciliation at the airport with Imogen and the daughter, Adila's daughter, and her sister.
By the way, does not seem that broken up by her mom being dead. Does she not know yet?
That's exactly what I'm saying, is that they're just giving each other hugs and being, you're going to be okay now. And like you said, I would be like shell shocked. Like, what just happened? My mother was a terrorist group and she's dead now. And you're probably responsible for her death. Like, she trusted you and you got her killed. Not that she shouldn't be happy that her situation has improved. We are assuming this is within days of what's happened. This girl should be like traumatized, utterly traumatized.
Yeah, it was kind of just like, all right, safe travel.
And and the sister too. Like the daughter might just be like not know the full,
right?
But the daughter, the sister just kind of like, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for what? Like, this is like not a big thank you for you, by the way. And by the way, to the point that I would be in that situation pretty certain that Imogen could have diffused things way before it led to my sister's death. Like, take the phone away from her. That's all.
Also, speaking of the daughter, did we need that whole DNA subplot?
Oh, I don't know. I guess it was just to prove that she was who she said she was, and then it turned out she was both things, but it's still strange because it doesn't necessarily mean one thing negates the other. I'm not sure why her having this daughter proved that she wasn't this the red Jinn or whatever they called her.
Jin El Raqqa or whatever. Yeah, I wish they had put some sort of button on that, because the last thing was her Malik saying it's not her, or whoever saying it's not her. The DNA match is that this is her daughter, so it's not the Jen Al Raqqa. And Elizabeth Moss's character saying, yes, it is, and I'll prove it. And okay, so it was, but I wish there just had been, I don't know. I don't really understand the point of the DNA thing if they weren't going to say, well, even though this is her daughter, and so we thought it couldn't be her, but now we realize it is because, I don't know, something.
Something.
Otherwise, leave it out. And I had texted this with you briefly. I just think if all of these ideas were going to get brought up in the 6th episode, there needed to be a little bit more development than there was in the prior episodes of her relationship with this guy, her relationship with her dad. They touched on it, but not in a way that made me think it was going to play such a principal role in the finale the way it did. Also, I don't know why she wouldn't just wait in that shed and be like, I'm just going to sit here until my dad comes back because I have some things to say. I feel like that would be very human, instead of being like, okay, my dad lied to me about being dead for most of my life, and now I'll move on to my next job.
I don't understand. That final moment, by the way, echoes all the way where she's in an airport. It echoes the very first scene of the series where she's in the airport. She goes, what's my name? What's my identity? What's my mission? And then that little smirk on her face, like, just another day at the office. Is this just another day at the office? You just found out your dad is still alive, which supposedly is like your genesis moment for your entire identity. And that your lover, this person that you turn to in your greatest moment of crisis, is the mastermind of this terrorist attack. And maybe this is how her weeks go, but this seemed like extremes. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe she has dozens of lovers around the world that are all secret Russian agents. Who knows?
And also, at one point, Michael is calling her both Imogen and Violet, and that bothered me. Was Imogen the daughter's name? Because at one point she says something about like the best lies are close to the truth. So then who was Imogen? Why did you make that comment? I don't know.
Right. True. Yes. Because I assumed that the same thing when she said that back in whatever episode 4 or so, I assumed that like, oh, so that is her real name. And she's just saying, so many aliases that she leans into. So maybe you're right. Maybe this is actually her daughter's name, which would be really perverse, by the way, to have Michael calling her both her name and her daughter's name. If that's the case, that's even more perverse.
Yeah.
Oh, and the funniest thing about this is just speaking to this moment of mid television that supposedly is prestigious. That smirk at the end, I very much feel like this is stay tuned for season 2. And I'm like, no one's going to watch. There's no season 2 of this ever coming. So don't hold your breath, people.
Yikes.
Okay. I think we can.
Yep.
We got that all out. And we vented our spleens, as they say.
Yep.
Okay. So next thing I want to talk to you about is, I think, more successful, but still very uneven, the show Under the Bridge, which just wrapped up yesterday. And I wanted to get your feel for, once again, do you recommend this one? Another thing I wanted to talk to you about, I've been wanting to talk to you about it for a few weeks, is I've been doing research on the side of the differences between reality and fiction. So much of the case is so true. So it was really interesting to me, the things that were egregiously different. And I honestly have to say, I think most of these adaptation choices were wrong. So I think I want to run them by you and think, is this a good modification to, once again, not for factual purposes, but for the purposes of drama itself. I'm not even saying like, oh, they didn't tell me exactly what happened exactly on the days. This is drama. This is not a documentary. But I'm talking about like the changes they made and whether they are an improvement from the facts that may have been a more compelling version of the story, in my opinion. But I want to run those past you. But before we get into all of that, we'll review the final episode. But before we even get to that, without any spoilers, would you recommend the show in general?
Oh, another tough one. Okay, here's the thing, and I think this will dovetail with what you're saying about the real life research. I think the actual story here of what happened to Rena is very interesting, and I want to know more about it. I would not recommend this show because I think I know it's based on a book. I have not read the book. Perhaps the perspective of this show is the same as in the book. I don't know. But I think the choice of perspective here was a giant error. I think the interesting thing is about the teenagers and what happened to this girl. I don't care one bit about, I'm sorry, because I hear she's passed away. I'd be sorry in any case, I guess, about the author of this book and her possibly fictional issues. The police officer was more interesting, marginally, and tied in a little bit to some of the themes here. But I just think it was a mistake to not focus this story on the teenagers.
Yep.
And yeah. So I think the teenage, I don't know how old they really are. I know sometimes 20 somethings or even 30 somethings play teenagers, but let's call them the teenage actors. I think they were excellent. I think
Teenagers. I don't think they're 14 in this case, but maybe 17, 18.
I really liked watching them. I was really interested in their characters. I had questions about their motivations and their lives and their inner lives. But instead, I spent time learning about this writer and her, I think, inappropriate fixation, regardless of what she was going through in her personal life, with this one teenage boy. And that was not where my interest lay in watching them.
I completely agree. Even in the final episode, when I was watching it last night, the stories among the younger characters are way more compelling than the adult characters. And we'll get into it, and I do feel like this is a problem of adaptation. There is a self-critique that Rebecca Godfrey, I think her name is, the author, made of her book, that she didn't really get to know Rena. The adaptation has been augmented by Rena's father's, called the Father's Story or something like that. Like he felt that there needed to be more about Rena in this. There's a self-critique in the book, in this adaptation itself, that Rebecca Godfrey had made this assessment of her own work. You see it in the story itself. They're like saying, is this justice for Rena? Question mark, based on her book. She really did sympathize much more with these characters who probably shared a biography with her. So she had this empathy towards them. And I think the show tries to grapple with this, but there is a more complex version of this story that is more focused on the kids, not only Rena, but the other characters as well. And to your point, these are changes from the original story and even from her original book that I think are mistakes. It did some strange adaptation. So the story is intriguing. The teenage performances, my general opinion here, teenage performances are excellent. The adults in general, I think, give good performances, but we didn't really even need their characters, or they could have been totally side characters and it would have been a better version of the show. So I do think that there are things to recommend this show. I think the finale is actually pretty strong.
I agree.
Personally, and we could get into details of the finale, but yeah, I think that this is a better show than The Veil, but also could have been a better show and really has some missteps in it. But in the finale itself, I thought, just to call out a few particular scenes.
I thought the scene between Suman and Warren was really actually very moving and really well done. And if anything, the adults that I wanted to learn more about were Rena's family members rather than the reporter and the police officer. Although, like I said, the police officer stuff I think did pay off to some extent, but I feel like there could have been so much more to say here about those characters, the teenagers and Rena's family. I just didn't understand the decision to try and tie this to Rebecca's experience with her brother,
Mhm.
which is a very sad story, but we're already dealing with one tragic story. And I feel like the central storyline was given short shrift at times
Mhm.
because of the focus on Rebecca and her brother. But I really was very moved by the scene between Suman and Warren in the finale.
Yeah, I think Archie Punjabi is definitely the highlight of the episode is that interaction. And also Warren on the stand later being like, I
Mhm.
did participate in the murder. I don't know why I did it. I think that's an important scene, by the way, because that is something that the series could have dealt with a little bit more is the question of when you're a teenager, when you are an outsider, when you have no control over your own life, when you're abused and bullied in your own way, and how you lash out, right? I was waiting for the longest time, like trying to get an understanding as to why did Rena rebel in this particular way. And maybe it's her own version of the irrationality of these other characters. And that would have been interesting to say, like, all these kids are in the same soup and it's a dangerous powder keg that could go the wrong way at any moment. And that would be more interesting to explore. But like you said, we don't really, we start focusing on them, then we drift over and we spend so much time on the Rebecca and her dealing with the trauma of the loss of her brother from when she was a kid, which once again, that could be interesting if it somehow becomes thematically tied in with these kids. But we have this whole digression and you shoehorn things in. Like, I think it is very interesting to address the re-education, like the re-education camps here in the US that was dealt with in Reservation Dogs, for example, excellent series that just wrapped up last year, and talking about how these Native American children were taken away from their parents and adopted or raised inside of these oftentimes Catholic establishments and abused and etc. And people like to think that didn't happen in Canada. It absolutely did happen in Canada at around the same time. Even in the 70s, it's still recent history for us in the US as well as Canada. All a huge topic that needs to be addressed. And like I said, Reservation Dog spent part of the final season trying to touch on some of these things. You can't just throw something that big as a 5-minute subplot in the final episode of the show. I appreciate what they're trying to do, but man, like that's not the place for it.
Yeah.
Although it is a powerful scene when she confronts her adoptive father, of course. So that's well done and
Agree.
good performance. But once again, I honestly simultaneously appreciated the scene for what it was trying to do and was like, this is not for this show. I'm sorry. It's just, there's enough here.
The fact that the father was referring to those girls as big girls
Right.
and she was previously in that home, and I'm not sure if we knew that before the finale, but I had forgotten if we did know that. That alone says so much about what was going on in that relationship that, like, yes, it's a whole other drama to explore, but did it belong here? I don't feel like it did.
So a couple of things towards the very end of the episode I want to touch on before we get into like the differences between fact and fiction. The one is the open acknowledgement for the past 2 episodes, by the way, more than that, I think. We have Rebecca actually confronted by her dad being like, are you giving Rena a fair shake here? So there's this open question about it, something that apparently she dealt with even back when she was doing interviews for the original book publication. She felt like she missed the mark. So she has dealt with this, or I mean, she's passed away, so did in the past deal with this. So she was aware of it. It wants to raise the comment that, hey, she didn't really do enough investigating Rena. But then I feel like the show made the same mistake. So it wants to criticize her for this and yet makes the same mistake by fictionally increasing her importance in the story. It's a very strange decision on their part.
It is, and it, I think, raises bigger questions about white perspectives on the stories of people of color, right? Which is like a much deeper thing that could have been explored here. I understand if it wasn't because it wasn't part of the book, but like to compound it by like this brown girl story was not quite interesting enough. So let us give you this white lady story. I don't know how I feel about that. Because I think the brown girl story was more than interesting enough.
Back when we were much younger, there was a movie called River's Edge that was about a true life, someone who was murdered by a group of friends, and how all these kids found the body and they basically hang out. And Keanu Reeves was in this movie, and it was based on a true story also. And it was not about the victim. It was explicitly about these kids and why they were the way they were and why they weren't telling anybody. And it really just hangs out with them. So my point is, this could have leaned into, I would not disagree with this. This could lean into exactly what you were saying. What if it was just that she was an invisible person and they just raged out on her and they really didn't care? And then the show basically explores that. That's actually not a bad way to explore the material, to lean into it, but to basically call out, hey, she really didn't get to know Rena. And by the way, this show, we didn't really try to get to know Rena either. I'm like, okay, well, what are you proving there? I don't understand that choice at all.
Yeah.
And one more thing at the end, what did you think of the very final moment where the parents find the Notorious B.I.G. CD and they start dancing to it and then they see Rena one more time? What'd you think of that scene?
I thought it was sweet. I thought a little bit hopeful that they're finding something that reminds them of her and seeing it in like a more light, happy way, right? So I liked it as a marker of the hope that there can still be something good to their lives after this really, really terrible thing that's happened. What did you think?
Yeah, I liked it as well. I think it was a nice touch. And I think it echoes back to something that Suman had said earlier, that she shouldn't have been so strict with her and said, don't listen to that music. Don't listen to those people. She should have opened herself up more. Although, once again, I don't know how true to life this is, but if you invite everybody over to dinner, that seems to be like a pretty open-hearted way to integrate them, and they actually steal your jewelry.
Yeah.
So I think that is a much more questionable thing. She did try to put out an olive branch. Part of the reason I was touched by it, I'm always trying to find common ground with my daughter. Obviously, she's much younger here, but I'm always interested in what she's interested in. Even if I'm not really that interested, I'm just trying to like keep engaged with what she's interested in. And then I think about like my relationship with my parents, for example, where we really have no common ground, and they are very much immigrants as well. So I empathize with their perspective here. They were very much, they have this very specific expectation of how the kids are going to behave. So we never built any common ground culturally as we were growing up. So I felt some resonance with this scene, and I think it was, I thought it was a pretty nice way to end things with a little bit of hope.
Yeah.
All right, here are some differences between the true story and the adaptation here. I'm going to start with some little things, which I really don't mind, but I just want to set them as context setting before we get into like the really big stuff, which I think that when you hear some of these adaptation choices, you're going to be like, that's what's wrong with the show. And that's what I think is interesting about doing this. Is not just to criticize the show, but to talk about adaptation. I'm always interested about adapting a story from one format to another. And I talk about it all the time here on the podcast specifically. The choices that were made explicitly to change the story, which I think, as I'm watching the show, those are the things that I think are wrong with the show. Anyway, there's some little things, really small things. First of all, they're running off to Mexico, supposedly. The girls in the book, when they were interviewed after the fact, they were like, they talked about it, let's run off to Mexico, but this was not ever a real plan. They didn't try to get fake passports or anything like that. All that is just made up, but fine. You're trying to illustrate your head space and add a little more dramatic. No problems there. Another really small thing, Warren didn't turn himself in at the dance. He knew that there was actually a big party after the dance, so it's not that dissimilar. He knew the cops were going to be there waiting for him, so he just turned himself in. He never stayed with Rebecca. That never happened. None of that stuff. All that stuff, which once again, trying to bond the two of them so closely. Yeah. I personally think that her actually hiding him in the house is so outlandish that I knew even watching the show that this didn't actually happen. So why add it, to be honest with you? Why add? He could have been, he's living alone in his house. His dad's away. He could have just.
Because she had to get him into her brother's suit. How was that going to happen otherwise?
Yes, I guess. Oh, and this is an interesting point. I'm not sure why they threw it into the show. He's Metis, which is indigenous people from that local area. He did not find this out until years after he was in prison. Many years later. It's weird that not only did they introduce that fact, but they throw it in like in a casual conversation. It's just really strange that they felt like they wanted to shoehorn that in. But it is interesting thematically to think about his background and how that could add to his own feeling of being an outsider potentially. Warren always admitted dragging Rena early on. I think they want to show the conflict.
Yeah.
He did change his testimony over time. So I think they want to show him progressively getting closer to that rather than him saying it right away and then not saying it on the stand and then saying it again. And then that just is just confusing to have him change his testimony every 5 minutes. So I have no problem with him like dramatically coming to this moment in this episode. I think that was a good way to structure things. Oh, and it was in an interview. That whole like I'm 3 and she's 7% responsible was never said on the stand. It was said during his recorded interview. Once again, more dramatic to put it on the stand up. Other minor things like Dusty's sister never really gave up on her, but she did actually pull a knife on her daughter, and she obviously was scared of having her in the house. So even the fact that we wanted like drive home the fact that Dusty has like no family anymore, that's not really the case. Her sister was always still involved with her upbringing, but hey, I don't think I would want her in the house if she pulled like a knife on my I gotta say.
Yeah.
So all that is understandable. I'm not complaining about any.
Yeah, nothing so egregious so far.
Right. Oh, this is a little more pronounced. I think Dusty felt guilty about things, but most of that is retroactively after the case was done. She gave a lot of interviews. They actually mentioned it here at the end in that placard at the end. She gave a lot of interviews where she was the most open about what had happened to Rena, but not beforehand. She wasn't as conflicted as they show on the show. So a lot of this is after the fact, and they're imposing it. Once again, I don't have a problem with that. This is a bigger one, slightly bigger, but I still don't really care that much. Josephine never mistrusted Dusty, and they never tried to murder her. Imply here in the show.
Okay.
All right, these are some bigger things that would be more interesting. Joe really is like, I had no idea that this had happened. Joe had the boots. Joe had Rena's boots, not Kelly. So something bad had happened to Kelly, that Kelly had done something really bad to Rena. It was not this shock. And I think that's a pretty big one. But
yeah, that's really interesting. Because they definitely came away with this. I came away from this with the idea of Kelly is a psychopath or sociopath, which she still could be. But Joe is a possibly redeemable person in a bad situation who is just trying to survive. And I think that would influence that a little bit.
Yeah, I completely agree. The whole thing where Kelly and Dusty and Joe also all called the cops and basically threw Warren under the bus and implicated him initially. That didn't happen, which once again, I don't know why they added that. And then they play the recordings back. They really use this as a way to ensnare the girls, and it never even happened. So it's a strange choice. I guess it's just to move things forward, but just an odd choice. When they started questioning Kelly, she immediately threw Joe under the bus. So the recording we see of her saying Joe did this and Joe told me to do this, and like basically overtly saying that Joe was responsible for the murder and saying she had nothing to do with it at all. And Joe instructed other people to beat up Rena and then kill her. That happened immediately. So it's almost like they imply there when she plays the recording for her that it's only like late in the game, like Kelly now has figured out a way to get out of juvenile hall, which is also fictionalized, by the way. And now she's starting to throw Joe under the bus. Apparently, she immediately threw Joe under the bus, which she's a scared kid. I'm not at all. Many troubled kids obviously did something absolutely horrible, but they want to make her some criminal mastermind. Once again, I don't understand the point of this, to say that these kids did these really messed up things and we're not really sure what's going on with their psychology. And by the way, Kelly is a one-dimensional monster is two contradictory things that I'm not sure what the show is trying to tell us with that. To that point, Kelly did not have a picture of Rena getting burned in the forehead, which I think is such a shocking detail
Oh,
that this is like a premeditated thing on her part.
that's
Did
okay.
not happen. So that's like a big, I think it's a big red flag for me on an adaptation.
Yeah, because that's something that goes towards whether she's a psychopath or not.
He did have temper problems, by the way, which is, I guess they wanted to illustrate that she had these dark fantasies or whatever, but she actually been kicked out of multiple schools. She would lash out. She was, I think when you see her on the stand in that final episode where she just starts to like
Yeah.
have a fit, that I think that was more her behavior. At the same time, if you wanted to basically say, here's a girl who lashes out violently when she feels wronged in even these slight ways and has emotional problems, that's a very different version that they want her to be like she's a criminal mastermind who's manipulating everybody around her, right? And I'm not sure why they try to vilify this one person and give so many of these other people who did terrible things a lot of slack, basically. So it's a strange need to vilify one person to make her into the bad guy
Yeah.
in this show.
That's definitely how it comes across.
Kelly was bullied in juvenile hall. She had people pour drinks on her. Basically, they bullied her because she had killed Rena, by the way.
Mhm.
So she was indeed bullied in there. But she was not released from juvie, even though she was overtly being bullied by multiple girls. They did not release her. She eventually was released when her parents paid her bond, but that was just a regular process of things, right? So once again, very much making it look like
Yeah.
manipulates everybody into getting her way. I don't understand why we
Needed that.
just think they're trying to
Yeah.
simplify the plot, but yeah. So I assume like that these things I'm telling you about Kelly are more pronounced, like
Yeah.
disparities that rub you the wrong way.
Yeah, in that it does come across very black and white that she is the most evil and, like I said, a psychopath. And but other girls are more possibly redeemable people in a bad situation, as well as Warren. So it's interesting if she is not the leagues above evil person, the way the show makes it out to be.
Warren G's girlfriend, here's another one that I think interesting. I already told you this one. I think this is probably the only thing that I previewed with you before. Her character's name is Samara. In real life, her name was Sarita. And the reason I mentioned that is that I'm not sure what her ethnicity is supposed to be in this show, but Sarita, the real person, was of Indian descent. So the whole idea, if you saw her as an animal because of her being an Indian girl or another in some way, is negated by the fact that he's dating an Indian girl. And I think they intentionally don't want to add that complexity.
Right.
Once again, I think the complexity is interesting.
I agree.
So, all right, here are the biggest mistakes. A lot of, if I just said, I think that they're adaptation choices, which are the wrong adaptation choices, but they're not catastrophic. I think these things I'm going to tell you right now, these things, all the complaints you have about the show.
Let's go.
In these few ones. First of all, Rebecca was not the one who cracked the case and started to investigate with the teens and get under their skin and hang out with them and get them to tell the truth of what happened that night. There were two girls called Nadja and Anna who were sisters, I believe, and they wanted vengeance for what had happened to Rena, and they started to hang out with Joe and start asking questions, and they would go and get high and hang out under the bridge and hang out with her and enter her inner circle. And they were doing their own investigation, and they were going to the cops and telling them everything that they were discovering, and the cops were ignoring them the entire time. So that is what they're surrogating onto these adult characters. It's way more interesting.
Way more.
Is those kids. Way more.
Yes. Agree.
Once again, the true story is way more fascinating
Yeah.
than this version of it. So the author in the real world, the author came back. She had already written the book, which was well regarded. It was about her teenage years. It's fictionalized. She starts hanging out, doing drugs, getting into punk music after the death of her brother, which legitimately happened. She was 13, he was 16, and she had had this very troubled period of time in this particular area of Canada. And what happens was, after the murders happen, after it becomes news, after these girls finally start to crack the case and bring this evidence to the cops and the cops start to investigate, after all of that, she then goes, I'm going to go back home and investigate this. So she is not the genesis point for this investigation. She is. So all those things you're complaining about, like, I can't believe that she did this. Most of the things that you're annoyed that the author did, she did not do. They're not true. They didn't actually happen in real life.
How about, I'm sorry if I'm jumping the gun, the author's relationship with Warren?
Okay, so that is interesting. She and Warren, as they do mention here, she did have this relationship with him. She literally says he couldn't have killed anybody. She basically takes his side aggressively in the book. I think what is conveyed in the series after the fact, right? Because so many of those things where they're a little too intimate is before the court proceedings begin. So she did have this intimate relationship with him after the fact. He did very much, in the writing of the book, throw Kelly more under the bus, have him as the bystander. Is that true, though? That's her impression of things. So there is a bias there that is being expressed, although it's not the same as, what it's conveyed here, where they're like way, way too intimate. Like at one point, you're like, is she going to make out with him at some point? Like,
It would, yeah. So strange to make that choice.
oh, and then of course, true to life, Kelly eventually, after throwing Joe under the bus, actually then starts to say it was Warren, it was Warren, it was Warren. Everyone starts saying it was Warren. He looks like he's going to take the brunt of this. And Kelly is more or less just going to get, like the other girls, get convicted for the beating, but not for anything beyond that. And once again, erasing these younger characters. There was a girl in the juvenile hall called Lily. She was abused as a teenager. This is a very sad story, by the way. Abused as a teenager. She becomes a sex worker to survive. She gets arrested for being a sex worker. So now she's in juvenile hall. And basically, she ruins her own possibility of parole by coming forward, and she's had conversations with Kelly, getting her to confess to the murder. And then she takes this to the higher ups. Once again, she's ignored for a long period of time because she's just this marginal person. They don't trust her. But eventually, they're able to follow up with the story with Kelly, and they get her to confess and yada, yada, yada. But once again, minimizing this marginal girl who's being ignored, and once again should be the theme of this entire show. And another character that's erased from this history, that relatively minor point, by the way, me bringing this up, how that revelation happens. But I do feel like it is a problem that they are trying to minimize the kids to maybe make them all like they were monolithically bad kids, when actually there was a big divide in how people reacted to Rena's murder. And they've erased all that because I don't know why you would erase these, I think, interesting details.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense to me because it seems like there was a more interesting version of this story right there. Yeah.
I think in your head, as I'm telling you these details, you can envision a version of this story where it's all young people and the adults are only there in a way. Obviously, they're the machine that they have to feed at some point. Sure. But they're also being ignored by this the whole entire time. Even if you wanted to fictionalize all this, imagine those two girls doing the two sisters doing the initial investigation, and they're meeting these other kids under the bridge. And are these kids going to try to murder them because they know that they're onto them? You could make a lot of suspenseful sequences out of what I've just described, instead of this really strange need to shoehorn in these adult characters and make them more important to happen, which once again, if you want to tell a story about how these adults look the other way, then tell that story, like in the structure of the show.
It makes me more curious about the demographics of the people who made this story and whether that somehow possibly subconsciously played into some of these choices, because it makes those decisions like even more confusing when there were more interesting ways to develop the story right there to be had.
Well, one of the showrunners, there's two showrunners. One of them, I think, is of Indian descent, and maybe, and I believe from Canada. So I think that just the fact that, and he's one of the head writers as well. So it's strange, some of the decisions being made. I completely agree. But we don't know what happens behind the scenes. Did they come up with that version of the script that I suggested? And they're like, oh, we got to beef up these roles. we need to get someone famous in here. The scripts might have been revised significantly by Hulu when they saw them.
Yes, and it may have been, well, nobody's going to watch this bunch of unknown, as far as I know, teenage actors. And so we need to get them bigger names, and you don't get the bigger names without giving them something to hold on to. They're not going to come in here to be peripheral characters.
Yes.
So yeah, maybe it was that, but it's unfortunate the price the actual story paid, if that's the case.
So this is an interesting one. So Godfrey's brother did die, like I told you,
Okay.
when he was 16. She was 13. He fell off this cliff. She had a total emotional collapse
Sure.
as a teenager dealing with this. She felt guilty about the death. She says that multiple times. Here they're trying, and I feel it's like in bad taste, by the way. I wonder if she was alive, feeling this guilt because of this romantic liaison she was having and stuff at the time, when in reality, from all the analysis I did, I actually did some research to try to find any interviews where she explained why she was guilty. She never explained why. She just said she felt guilty about her brother's death. But I have a feeling like that's just a child who survived.
Sure. Yeah.
There's remorse, right?
Yeah.
About like your brother not being around and someone you looked up to your whole entire life. So obviously, I think that is what probably led her into this kind of emotional tailspin at that early point in her life. In my version of the story, she does show up after the investigation has begun. And then you can use the fact that, she lost her brother at the same period of time. She was a wild child at the same age as these were. To add color, this is what happened to me. And this is why I am empathizing with them. Okay, great. That's all great. But why, like, she doesn't have to be the center of the show, basically, is what it comes down to. And she could still have as many lines of dialogue. I'm not sure why they had to structure it this way, where she's the investigator. It just makes sense. Okay, and here's the big one, Sona. Here's the big.
I'm ready.
Cam doesn't exist. There was no relationship with this person. This character doesn't exist. She had no relationship with this person. No sexual relationship. No relationship with a fictionalized character. Doesn't exist. She doesn't.
That's insane.
Which once again goes to the fact that why do we need to have this fictionalized character, and then she has a sexual relationship with them? Like, just make them be childhood friends that she can talk about. This is what happened to me when my brother died. To have them in a sexual relationship. I don't know this woman's personal life, but she was married and had a daughter when she passed away. Maybe, who knows? Maybe she had a lesbian lover when she was a teenager, but I'm pretty sure the showrunners don't know that either.
Not just that, it's not even a well-developed relationship. It's like they planted seeds, but
There's inconsequential.
Yeah.
Consequential to the story. Yes.
Easily it could have been my brother's best friend and the sister and the brother's best friend. Like that would have worked just fine. And they were bonded together by that forever after. Instead of laying the groundwork for this sexual tension and prior relationship that never came to anything anyway.
Exactly. Which gets completely dropped. By the way, all these themes, the Native American relocation of those children, all these things can be addressed intelligently, but they're not here. They're just shoehorned in. And especially here, this is the worst of it, honestly, to invent a character, which is totally fine to have this character and then have it from the perspective of this displaced person who's also being ignored by the police department. Then you can simplify all of this, make that character the main character in the story. Now that character can take on the burden of all these other plot threads, right? Like I was one of these girls. I was displaced. I was an outsider. I was bullied because of my ethnicity. And now I'm being ignored by these same police that are ignoring these girls. And now you can frame the whole story that way. Like you said, they've added a second adult character here. One is based on a true character loosely. The other one is completely fictionalized. And now you're making these two characters really fill the part that one character should fill. And then worse than that, you're like, oh, and they're in love with each other or something? What is this?
Yeah, especially if it were real. Okay, maybe. It probably still didn't need to be included. But hey, especially if it's not real.
Real. It's not real. All right. So based on all those things I just said, do you have the most egregious mistake here in the plotting? What do you think?
I think it's that Cam doesn't exist. Yeah, I think it's the last one.
it's so crazy because not only do you now have her, so this is a fictional character who now has to take on the burden of representing this, underclass and who has this empathy, who's being ignored by her dad, who's happens to be a police officer also. So he has to take on the burden of being a surrogate for Rena if she had grown up, who also happens to have a sexual relationship with the author of the book that this whole thing is based on, who also supposedly their relationship when they were teenagers led, this is where I think it's pretty distasteful, by the way, led to the death of the brother, who's like now the origin point for the Rebecca Gottfried character. So there is a lot that is now balanced on top of a fictional character. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, I'm trying to just spitballing about like, okay, say, I don't know how Lily Gladstone came to be involved in this, but say someone said, oh, Lily Gladstone really wants to do this, but there's no part that works for her. So you had to create a fictional character, but why couldn't it be like a neighbor to the family or something that like serves as like a sounding board for what the family is thinking as they're going through this or something? There had to be a better option than this.
Not for nothing, but you also have to remember that Lily Gladstone is on the poster art for this series. But who was Lily Gladstone? When they started shooting this in 2022, she had finished making Killers of the Flower Moon, but Killers of the Flower Moon wasn't even out. Nobody knew she was going to get an Academy Award nomination. She was up and coming, but I don't think anyone's like, oh, we're going to put her on the poster. But accidentally, if you had gotten Reese Witherspoon, I think she's one of the producers on this series, you can imagine them blowing her proportions of her story. But you really don't need to do that with Lily Gladstone. And then you could say maybe they added her to the edit, like after the fact, they're like, oh, she's a name now. Let's beef up her part. But that doesn't explain how they put in a lesbian romance between the two of them. That was obviously on the page before anybody was cast. Like, what purpose does that serve? It's really bizarre. And I don't have a problem with them throwing that in there. It's just distracting once again from what is interesting about it.
Yes, the whole thing comes off as somehow the main story of Rena and what happened to her not being interesting enough. And I just can't get on board with that. I think it's fascinating.
And all that is to say, if all these things were in balance with each other and well developed, that's fine. But like you said, they introduced the romance, throw it out the window the next day in the next episode, and that never comes back up again. And for me, the thing I wanted the most out of this series, and I did not get, was some understanding as to why Rena made the choices she made. I don't want it to explain her in some way, like maybe it can't be explained, but I don't think like I got to know Rena very well in this series. Right.
For sure.
Anyway, so thumbs up. We spent an hour complaining about it.
I think it's a trickier thing when you're talking about a real life story, right? Because it's so easy for us to sit and judge things and be glib about it. Like, why did they do this? Why did they do that? This character is an idiot. It feels much different when you're talking about real life people. But then the differences that we're discussing now are a whole other side of an issue of how the story is developed that we don't usually have to deal with, right? Usually it's just poor story construction and nothing more, right? Of like, you thought this was going to be interesting to somebody, but nobody cares. I guess the same is true here. It feels different to me when you're talking about something that's real life, and I do feel bad when I judge these characters who are actual human beings. But some of these decisions we're discussing that are completely fabricated and conjured up out of thin air, I don't understand it.
Yeah, and to that point, exactly. There's one version of this where you just simply criticize the construction of the story, like we've done here on the podcast many times, when something's purely fictionalized and you're like, wouldn't it be more interesting if they had made this choice, or why did they make that choice? And I'm always curious about the choices people make creatively, even when they're the wrong choice, because it's an interesting thought experiment, right? But in this scenario, and I find this so much with true life, whether it's even just documentaries that are supposedly factual, which are oftentimes very fabricated as well, but even when you compare it to documentaries, but definitely when you see like true crime podcasts and series, when I actually delve into the case itself, oftentimes the things that are excised are the very things that I think are the most interesting aspects of the story. So it's very strange when they'll literally say, well, let's just cut this out. And I find it so egregious in this adaptation that the sister investigators, which initiated this whole entire story, are cut out when, in a way, like in my mind's eye, we should have begun with those two sisters. That should have been the first scene of the first episode of this show. And the fact that they cut that out is so strange because the mistakes they make here in adapting the story reinforce the mistakes that the original story did, minimizing Rena and then simplifying the decisions that these kids made. And you're removing that, you're criticizing that. And then simultaneously, let's minimize the importance of these teenage characters. And by the way, let's not really get to know Rena very well. You can't criticize the thing you just did. Man, you did a terrible job of getting to know Rena just like we did. But there are some highlights here. The young actresses.
So good.
All of them.
So
doing
good.
Excellent work. Yeah. The less focused it is on supposedly our main characters, the more interesting the show is. And also, like, and speaking of, also very secondary characters, Rena's parents, who I think give terrific performances, especially Archie Punjabi, just gives great performance. Yeah. All right. So that is our assessment there of the series. And a pretty long episode with me ranting about all those changes.
Oh, I did my share as well.
Of course. And so, yeah, I'm going to try to watch Eric. I've heard some very mixed reactions to it, but try to maybe watch the first couple episodes and then we can discuss it early next week, maybe. And we'll see. And then you can, kind of like Ripley, you can say like, am I going to finish this or not? Well, I leave that open to conversation there.
Sounds good. Good.
Thanks again for the conversation.
Thank you. Talk to you later.
All right.
Bye.